Good afternoon and welcome to our look at fair housing and appraisal discrimination. We will probably have a few more folks joining us, but we want to honor the time that you've set aside to join us today. We're very pleased to look at this particular topic in a little more detail and talk about this from an advocacy point of view. I am very excited to have the entire Fair Housing Center of West Michigan Education and Outreach Department helping with this call today. I am Liz Keegan. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach for the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. And co-presenting with me today is Lindsay Owens, our Education and Outreach Coordinator. And behind the scenes, making all the magic happen, is Brianna Miranda, also an Education and Outreach Coordinator. So I see we still have folks logging on, but I'd like to get to the housekeeping. All of you are muted and your cameras are automatically off. Please use the chat to request any assistance. It's helpful if you could put any questions you would like for us to answer in the Q&A feature on the Zoom taskbar. We are recording this class today and we will post it online as we have throughout this series. We are very fortunate to be able to provide these fair housing trainings at no cost, thanks to the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, or MSHDA, commonly called MSHDA. So those entire series of classes that we've been doing over the last year are available on a YouTube page that we will share out with you once we have the recording finalized. We will also have evaluations, a link that we'll provide towards the end of the class today. They will also be in your browser. Once you exit the webinar, you'll see a tab with our evaluation in there. If you would like a certificate for your attendance today, you can request it. It's optional, and you use the evaluation to make that request. So please be sure to watch for that SurveyMonkey in your browser or watch for the link at the end of the training. So as I mentioned, we can't see or hear you, but we do really always welcome questions in the Q&A feature. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. I think we will kind of go ahead and get started with one more big thanks to MSHDA. We've been able to put on, I think, about 9 trainings so far under a really generous grant with MSHDA, looking at a lot of fair housing issues that are very timely. And as you'll see, as we kind of review some of the cases and studies on appraisal discrimination, I think you'll agree this is a very timely issue and a very important one. So thanks for taking time on the lunch hour to join us. We've done our introductions, but we'll talk very briefly about the Fair Housing Center, provide an overview of fair housing, kind of always want to level set, make sure people understand what fair housing is, how the laws are set up, and what discrimination looks like. Of course, our emphasis today is looking at appraisal discrimination. It's very important that we understand the history of appraisal discrimination because we are really still feeling the direct tie to that history and the effects of that history. And then, of course, we'll kind of segue into what's happening currently, looking at some cases, some studies that have been done. We want to highlight from the advocacy point of view some signs of possible discrimination and actions that can be taken. And of course, we'll talk about reporting discrimination before we close today at the 2 o'clock hour. So I'll also want to make sure you all have received an email from us, from our office. We provided the PowerPoint slides and a fair housing rights material. We have tons of information in this PowerPoint, lots of links to all the studies and to a lot of the sources that we are sharing with you, some videos, cases, settlements, things like that. So make sure you got the handout email from us. And if not, let us know in the chat and Bree can send that to you. Some really good resources there as well. So I'll be presenting with Lindsay today, and you can connect with Brianna, with any tech assistance that you may need. So briefly about the Fair Housing Center, I see some familiar names, and welcome to those of you who are new to the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. We abbreviate everything in housing, and we also abbreviate our name to FHCWM. We are located in Grand Rapids, but we do cover a large service area. We began in Grand Rapids in 1980. We are a private nonprofit. We grew out of kind of a grassroots effort looking at desegregating schools and integrating neighborhoods in the late 70s, and we have since significantly grown. However, we've always had the focus on fair housing. Our mission is largely remained the same, preventing and eliminating illegal housing discrimination. We are working to ensure equal housing opportunity across the board and promoting inclusive communities as well. Our services include education and outreach programs like today, research, advocacy, and enforcement on behalf of clients. We, again, are a private nonprofit, so we don't have enforcement authority. We also do not have attorneys on staff, so none of the information we're sharing is legal advice because we are not attorneys and therefore cannot provide legal advice. So everything we're covering today is educational purposes only. Our emphasis on fair housing and being able to, have a luxury as a nonprofit of only focusing on one very large area is that we're very passionate about fair housing, and we believe it's so critical to our success in today's communities because where we live directly affects how we live. It's very, very closely tied in how our communities and neighborhoods have developed. So being able to choose freely the housing that meets your needs, free from discrimination, is really important. It's hard enough given this, record housing shortage, lack of affordable housing, lack of accessible housing, lack of quality housing. Adding a layer of discrimination on top can really be devastating and certainly complicate something that's very difficult on a good day now much further. So again, really thankful for all of you taking the time to sign on and think about fair housing with us today. We have a network of other full-time fair housing centers in the state. Metro Detroit, Southeast and Mid-Michigan is kind of the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area. Southwest Michigan is based out of Kalamazoo, Battle Creek area. And of course, we're in Grand Rapids. And it's probably a little bit easier to kind of visualize the state of Michigan here. We cover the teal counties. We also end up providing a lot of education to the industry in the orange counties as well. And there is a legal services group in the Flint area, that navy blue, that does fair housing work as well. So if you are in a different geographic area, you're welcome to reach out to us and we will connect you to your local fair housing center if we are not your local fair housing center. So we'll look at what fair housing is very quickly and the protected classes before we kind of dive in a little bit further to our subject today. So fair housing is about that right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination based on protected classes that exist under federal, state, and sometimes local fair housing laws. So there's a lot of layers to the law. It can be kind of complex. There are some gray areas. So whenever we are thinking about whether something is a fair housing issue, our first question is who is impacted? And it's because of these protected classes. It's really important that people know them, get familiar with them. So if you're wondering if something is a fair housing issue, you can look at what groups are protected or always reach out to us with questions. But that's really our first question is who is this policy, this business model, this advertisement, who is it impacting? And that's how we can help start evaluate if something is unlawful discrimination. Fair housing laws were crafted very well and in multiple layers of years. And there's also, of course, lots of case law that has come online, but they protect from discrimination on these protected classes in any housing transaction, including rentals, sales, lending, homeowners insurance, property insurance. We're focusing on appraisals elements today. We also see fair housing implications in zoning and land use. So they were really very well written civil rights laws that really can cover most, if not all parts of a housing transaction. Generally, fair housing laws are about accessing housing, but there are also protections that exist after someone has rented the apartment, rented the home, or bought the condo, et cetera. For those of you who have been participating in fair housing training, you have seen over the years the list of protected classes start to grow significantly. And that is something that we can see here on this slide as well. In the 1860s and 1960s, we got our federal fair housing protected classes there on the left. Federal protections mean these apply anywhere in the country in the United States. It's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, skin color, national origin, meaning where someone is from, what their ethnicity or ancestry is. Maybe they speak with an accent. Those would all be covered elements under national origin. Sex protections have really grown recently in the last few years. At the federal level, there's a current interpretation of the law that allows for cases of sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination to be covered under sex protections that were added in the 1970s. We also have religion, physical or mental disability, and families with children under the age of 18, all as protected classes across the US. And that's whether the housing is available on the private housing market or whether it's subsidized through state or federal dollars. Any of HUD's housing is subject to the equal access rules. So HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And any property that accepts any sort of financial assistance from the federal government has to comply with more guidance and more guidelines. And notable among those is an equal access rule. It's 3 parts. It first went into place in 2012, but it protected marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity in HUD housing specifically, much earlier than the rest of the country had those protections. Here in Michigan, we actually have a very early history of civil rights laws addressing housing access from the 70s. The Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, we call it ELCRA for short, was very ahead of its time. Marital status, meaning whether or not somebody is married, widowed, divorced, et cetera, is a protected class. The age protections also exist at the state level. We have, as of February of this year, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression now officially protected here in the state of Michigan. And then at the local level, it depends. There's over 40 cities, townships, counties in Michigan that have local fair housing ordinances. Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, East Grand Rapids, Traverse City, for example, all have local fair housing protections. So we can help you figure out what those protections might be. And we also have ways to kind of help you look for local laws across the state if you're looking to find out who's protected in the population that you serve or advocate on behalf of. So we are always very happy to try to help with that. What is covered in terms of housing? A lot. There are very few exemptions, and this list sometimes surprises people. So apartments, whether they're leased or rented, houses, condominiums, HOAs, homeowners associations, those types of communities, whether they're sold, leased, or rented, are all covered properties. Even empty lots that are zoned for housing construction can be covered by fair housing laws. I mentioned the homeowners associations or HOAs. Mobile and manufactured home developments are covered. Homeowners insurance, rooming houses, transitional housing, and some homeless shelters, even if they are considered someone's residence, if they have no other place to go back to and they're allowed to return. There are shelters that are also covered by fair housing laws. College dorms, housing co-ops, kind of shared housing models, and housing run by the federal government or public housing agencies or authorities such as housing commissions, and more. So hopefully that's a good sampling to help you understand how far-reaching fair housing laws are. Some of the illegal activity that we see are changes in all of these elements of housing. It has to be a change that is directly tied to a protected class. So you can see ads promoting kind of the perfect tenant or resident. That often is an advertising violation. Phrases like perfect for, ideal for, we see some of that, unfortunately, even now. People being steered towards or away from specific locations or neighborhoods because of a protected class. If a housing provider is changing eligibility criteria, application processes, documents, even their policies, terms, and conditions related to the housing because of a protected class, that would be illegal. Sometimes we see discounts and specials or even maintenance services withheld or set aside for only specific populations, and that can be discriminatory. And then, of course, if you're paying for amenities like access to a pool or laundry facilities that come with your housing, that is equally protected because that's part of what you're paying for. And unfortunately, we are also seeing a significant trend of harassment in housing. This can be based on any of the protected classes and, of course, does also include, unfortunately, sexual harassment. This is a creation of kind of an atmosphere where people don't feel safe. There's threats. There's people being pressured to have unwanted sexual relationships. We've seen people being threatened, unfortunately, their lives were threatened because they moved into a home or neighborhood. So those are all things that are explicitly prohibited by fair housing law. Difference in treatment is kind of the part 2 question. Who is the housing potentially impacting? What's the protected class is always our first question, is who? And the follow-up is, okay, now we know who they are. Are they being treated differently? Can we prove that there's a difference in treatment, which kind of builds a basic fair housing claim here? So what we want to see from the housing industry and housing professionals is essentially equal treatment, regardless of any of the protected classes. As you'll hear today with some of our case examples, unfortunately, we do have a lot of work to do. the importance of spending time thinking about fair housing rights it's just critical. And again, thank you all so much for joining us to think about this with us today. There are a lot of housing professionals who are looking to do the right thing. Some of you are on the call, and we are just really appreciative of people who take the time to think about fair housing from a compliance perspective. Unfair policies have reinforced our segregated living patterns for decades and decades and decades. It can often prevent the creation of diverse neighborhoods, which a lot of home seekers are looking for. Our local economies can suffer when fair housing discrimination or when housing discrimination happens. We see decreased property value, loss of tax revenue. People don't feel safe or welcome, or they don't want to invest in the community. So population can be reduced and business activity can be diminished. It also can result in just decreases in home ownership, which can threaten the stability and strength of our communities. So fair housing rights protect our neighborhoods from these discriminatory practices and really foster the creation of those stable, inclusive communities of opportunity. That is what we're seeking to uphold. And as I've sort of referenced already, I mean, where we live matters so much. You see our Equal Housing Opportunity logo here in the center. That's a tool from the federal government, the house with the equal sign in there. It really is at the heart of access to critical amenities and things that we need to succeed in life. So not only healthcare, employment, education, but also what sort of transportation we can have, whether we have the ability to build wealth through homeownership, if that's the choice that we want to make. Is there a grocery store in your neighborhood? Is there a park where you can recreate? Do you have access to a pharmacy and good groceries? Healthy food, things like that are all tied to where we live in our modern neighborhoods. So equal housing access is very, very important. And what are the implications now, diving into this specific portion, this element of appraisal discrimination? We want to make sure people understand appraisal. And if we use terms or acronyms that you don't understand, feel free to put it in the Q&A. Again, we really welcome questions, but want to make sure everybody understands what an appraisal is. And then we'll look at how they can be discriminatory after we look at the history. So appraisals are estimates or opinions of the value of a specified residential real property, a home, made in a business context in connection with the sale, rental, financing, or refinancing of a dwelling, or in connection with any activity that otherwise affects the availability of a residential real estate related transaction. Appraisals can be oral or written and transmitted formally or informally. So these are estimates or opinions, and right there creates a lot of gray area. So we have folks that are assigned through their work to go out and do these evaluations, and it can be informed by their opinion. And that has led us, I think, into a lot of the situations where we're seeing inequalities. Home loan lenders, the banks, hire appraisers to provide independent, fair, and objective estimates, hopefully, of the market value of a property. So the lender can accurately evaluate the risk of issuing that loan. So as part of applying for the loan, the lender does some assessment and homework. Part of that is hiring an appraiser to go out independently, create this objective estimate of the cost of the property based on the state of the current market. So the lenders can decide, are we going to make this loan, or is this loan too risky for us to grant to this person? It also could be a refinance situation or a loan where someone is looking to take equity out of their home. Appraisals are critical and necessary elements of home buying and lending. It determines how much people make when they sell their home, how much people pay when they buy a home, and how much equity people can access, as I mentioned, during a refinance. So refinancing can allow people to get funds using their home as equity or collateral to put in a driveway, replace the furnace, get a new roof, invest back in that home as one option. And again, that's a critical element to maintaining a home, keeping the investment that many of us make. That is really the largest purchase of our lifetimes. Again, if we choose home ownership, to really uphold that, invest in it, and maintain it. What is considered? These appraisers consider the overall condition of the home, the square footage, the size of the lot that the house is on, the location and surrounding amenities, the interior and exterior features, any built-ins, any additions that have been made, the age of the property. Commonly, they estimate the value of the home by comparing it to similar other recently sold properties in comparable neighborhoods. So again, some kind of wiggle room and gray area in terms of what's comparable, what's similar. So those are kind of some of the spots where we've seen trouble arise. Under fair housing law, it's illegal for people to be discriminated against in any housing transactions because of their race, color, religion, all the protected classes that we reviewed. Appraisals are included under the designation of real estate related transactions for the law. So that's how they are covered under fair housing law. So I'm going to bring Lindsay on to talk about the history of appraisal discrimination. Lindsay.
Thank you, Liz, so much for that base on appraisals and fair housing. We're going to get into a little bit of the history of appraisal discrimination in the United States. Like Liz said earlier, if you're interested in learning more about what's talked about in this presentation, especially this history section, I'd encourage you to check out the resources linked at the bottom of each slide. So sometimes when we discuss the history of appraisal discrimination, we begin with policies and practices that are in the 20th century. And it's important to understand that the roots of appraisal discrimination in our communities and country start earlier than that, kind of before the founding of the United States. In the early 1600s, as European colonizers started coming to North America, they appraised land based on who lived on it. Europeans typically viewed indigenous lands as having little value unless white people took it over and lived on it. And this view of the value of indigenous land was used in treaties to justify indigenous displacement and genocide and taking land. This created a legal precedent in our history of our country for associating race with the value of land. Jumping forward several centuries, during the Great Depression, many homeowners were finding it extremely difficult to make monthly mortgage payments and were experiencing home foreclosures. And so to address this problem, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, was created by the government under the New Deal to address these problems. A couple of years after the HOLC's founding, they were asked by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board to create hundreds of residential security maps to assess the level of risk for providing home loans in different neighborhoods and cities. The maps HOLC created rated different neighborhoods in various cities from desirable to hazardous and were shaded in a specific color. So green meant desirable and was the best grade. Blue meant still desirable and was second grade. Yellow meant declining and was third grade. And red meant hazardous and was the worst grade or fourth grade. Race, specifically the percentage of Black people, was included as a factor in determining the desirability of neighborhoods. Communities of color were almost always graded as hazardous and shaded in red, including neighborhoods with small numbers of Black residents. Grades on these maps were based on the opinions of real estate professionals, including the opinions of appraisers. Here's some examples of HOLC maps created for different cities in Michigan, including Grand Rapids, Muskegon, Detroit, and Kalamazoo. Here's a sample area description for a neighborhood on the northeast side of Grand Rapids. You can notice the focus on the types of inhabitants listed, including Polish, Italian, and Black families, and the clarifying remarks discuss an infiltration of people of lower living standards in the neighborhood. The determinations made of these maps included race and ethnicity as determining factors for the neighborhood's value. Here's another sample area description for a neighborhood that the Fair Housing Center West Michigan is located near on the southeast side of Grand Rapids. You can notice the inclusion of types of inhabitants again as a detrimental influence in the neighborhood and the presence of Italian and Black families. Again, here is another neighborhood on the southeast side of the city of Grand Rapids, part of what is now the Baxter neighborhood, where the type of inhabitants was noted as determining factor for the map description. You can also see a discussion of certain demographics of people, in this case, Black people, being of the better type, which is just a really awful statement to make.
I found it concerning that they specifically noted where those families were living as well.
Yeah. Whereas we can see here's a green rated, or I think the highest grade neighborhood in what would be known as East Grand Rapids, I believe, described as the most desirable section of the Grand Rapids resident area, as being highly restricted, likely to certain people, demographics of people who weren't able to live there, that there's no presence of foreign-born families and Black families in these areas. And so we can see from some of these map descriptions that like race wasn't just like a small part of how these maps were graded. It was a large part of how they were graded, and the value placed on these neighborhoods. These maps were adopted and utilized by the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, for mortgage insurance underwriting purposes. Federal mortgage insurance underwriters were instructed to reject or give poor ratings to loan applications from neighborhoods inhabited by inharmonious racial or ethnic groups. It was very difficult and sometimes impossible for people living in redlined areas to get mortgage loans for homes in those areas, especially Black people, and Black families were often barred from living in outer ring suburbs where they may have had a better chance for getting a mortgage loan. And generations of Black families and other families of color were barred from owning homes in their communities, impacting the ability to transfer wealth across generations. Other explicitly discriminatory principles and practices used from the 1930s to the 1970s promoted an unfounded association between race and risk in housing and financial markets. These practices promoted the idea that a home should be valued based on its neighborhood, and that a homogeneous all-white neighborhood held the highest value in housing and financial markets. The following are some sample excerpts from texts and manuals guiding appraisers that show these discriminatory practices and principles present in the teaching of appraisers all the way from the 1930s to the 1970s. These excerpts promoted the idea that neighborhoods should be homogeneous, and changes in neighborhood demographics were viewed as causing instability and neighborhood decline. And so I won't read through all of these, but there are some highlighted words to add emphasis to the use of race and the associations between race and risk and how appraisers have been taught through generations.
And required, right?
Yeah.
This is what they were trained to do and required to do. And ominously, the bottom yellow highlight there, continue to be occupied. It is necessary that properties continue to be occupied. So really kind of intending for this to go forward, and it sure.
Yeah. Here is an example from an appraising manual in near the 1950 and 1946, where race and ethnicity and nationalities were ranked from best to worst on their detrimental effects in appraising manuals. And it promoted this unfounded risk between race and ethnicity, and the risk and lower value of neighborhoods. And so we see like people groups, like these are people being rated as who is the best and who is the worst. And we have to think about like whose perspective is it from, who's ranked as like the best and the worst people to give loans to. There isn't any evidence that people who are Mexican, for instance, I'm Mexican, are a greater risk to loan to. There isn't evidence for that back then, and there's not evidence for that now. Yeah, and these, like Liz said, these were like required, like this was in manuals that taught people how to enter and value neighborhoods in their trade for the rest of their lives. And despite the passing of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, explicitly discriminatory appraisal guidance continued, even though it was illegal. This course material emphasized the association between race and values, stating that minority group segments of the population can hinder community growth. There's no evidence to back that up, but that's what they were teaching.
You know, and I feel compelled too, because anyone who actually wanted to buck this system could lose their job or be penalized. I haven't found information on what happened to appraisers who wanted to deviate from these requirements, but I do know real estate agents were also required to discriminate and were penalized and potentially lost their livelihood if they didn't want to comply with a lot of these regulations. And so, you know, there were people trying to stand up against this, but really this creates, I mean, this is decades and decades and decades of requirements that people were trying to stand up against.
Yeah. Yeah, so some of the key takeaways that we wanted to leave you with all this history and yeah, just like hard stuff to like think about and reflect on within appraisals and how all of our neighborhoods have been valued. I want to explicitly note that the information stated in these manuals, the way that neighborhoods are colored on HVLC maps is not true. There's not an association between race and risk, nor should there have ever been. And the language used in these excerpts and security map descriptions is rooted in the belief that white people are superior to Black people and other people of color. And that's just not true. But we know that these discriminatory practices and policies are unjust and have horrible impacts. We know that the appraisal system has historically undervalued homes in communities of color. Appraisal principles and practices have perpetuated an unfounded association between race and risk that persists today, and we'll see that in some of the case examples we show. Because appraisals continue to be used in home buying and lending processes, it's really important for us to understand the history, to think about the history, to know that it happened and what to look out for. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Liz to talk about the current state of appraisal discrimination.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I encourage all of you, again, to check out the handouts and let us know if you didn't receive them so that we can forward them. We send a lot of emails, and so, you know, feel free to ask us to resend or check your, maybe we've been allocated to clutter or even junk. But Lindsay did a phenomenal job really pulling a lot of this information together and was very conscientious. They included all of the links on the slides so that if there is something that you want to kind of look back into, it's very likely linked there for you. If not, if you're looking for information, feel free to reach out because there's a ton of good information on it. But I do think the framework, Lindsay, you provided is really excellent for us to understand what has happened, what brought us to this point so that we can now look at and unfortunately hear from modern cases. And it can be very difficult to hear. So thank you for acknowledging that. These are situations that we'll cover fairly quickly, but I do want to acknowledge that there's real harm here and it can be both personal and community level harms. So I want to acknowledge that, you know, some of the stories that we'll share in language it is very difficult. I think it's important that we know about it so that we can learn from history and start to really challenge ourselves not to repeat it. So this appraisal discrimination has been sort of a well-kept secret for a very long time. We heard from a lot of communities of color as this kind of came up on the national radar a few years ago with some headlines I'll share here shortly. You know, this was something that every family of color knew, had experienced, knew someone who experienced, and, you know, frankly expected it more often than not. So when it did finally blow up and make national headlines, it took a lot of people by surprise, but not everyone. This was the first one that came across my radar, and it was really encouraging. In my years of fair housing, we don't see a lot of national news stories, let alone years of follow-up, focusing on fair housing and the elements of this unique threat of the civil rights movement. But here is one of the first posts really that kind of got people to look at this twice. It was this was a home in Florida, I believe, but this post shared that their home appraisal, the first appraisal they had, while not removing any of the items that demonstrated that a mixed race family lived in the home and owned the home, you know, their first appraisal was $330,000. And the second appraisal, once they removed evidence of their family and had the white dad remain on the property only for the second appraisal was $465,000. And they shared a fact of Black-owned homes at the time being devalued 23% on average. This was quickly followed by other cases. This is a woman in Chicago who went through the same process of being surprised or upset by the first valuation and inviting in a second appraisal and seeing a $62,000 increase. This is Oakland, California, a $439,000 difference that HUD took on. So again, this is kind of 2020, 2021, and we've seen just kind of a domino effect of many cases. We will look at a few more in a little bit of detail here as well. But you can find cases all over, and they range, you know, they're not small amounts. This led to a really incredible documentary called Our America Lowballed, and I'm hopefully going to successfully navigate us to look at just the trailer and hear a little bit more about one of the cases we'll look at, and we'll hear from the folks directly, but I encourage you, and again, this is linked. If you click on the icon in the PowerPoint, you have access to the entire documentary. Try that again.
Then I went through the work of whitewashing my home, removing everything that represented me, my family, my culture, everything. And then in a couple of days, I got the appraisal report back. I was right. The only thing bringing down the value of my home was me.
The story of Paul and Tanisha Austin has gone viral, shared all across the world.
My wife went through her bathroom to get rid of her hair products, all of our books and our art. Like, just literally like, okay, did we miss something? We had a conversation with one of our white friends, and she was like, no problem, I'll be Tanisha.
So it appraised for 1.482.
Almost 1.5, $500,000 more.
And like, how does that happen?
It's one of those stories that you start looking into and it just balloons and becomes bigger and bigger.
I think what we're seeing out of this is that the problem is extremely widespread.
The house is the house. Why would you go through such ridiculous lengths to belittle Black people and devalue them?
We found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by about $48,000 per home. This is happening all over the United States, robbing families of the money people use to live the American dream.
We're going to put the entire appraisal industry under the microscope.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel.
And these stories are shocking, and they are evidence that systemic change is urgently needed.
The system itself is so broken.
Your home is valued for $25,000 less than 2 doors down from you. How does that happen to the HUD secretary?
You know, because I live in a Black neighborhood.
That's not what you call regulation. That's not what you call oversight. That's not, of course, what you call fairness.
We pay our taxes like everybody else does, so why is it that I'm being treated this way?
So I really encourage you to check that out. We did get to see or hear directly from Paul Austin and Tanisha Tate Austin earlier in the clip. This is a family living in Marin City. They're a Black couple with kids. They made news headlines in 2021, so kind of continuing that trend where people were experiencing this type of discrimination, but also sharing it out. They sued a real estate appraiser, Jeanette Miller, for undervaluing their home because of their race. They went through the process of what has now commonly become called whitewashing, of removing any evidence of the race of the people who live there and own the home, up to and including hair products, photographs, personal memorabilia, trying to explain to children. There's several interviews with families who tried to have to educate their family about why they were asking them to put away certain toys, and had to explain whitewashing to young children while they were trying to get the value of their home. So this home that they had bought back in 2016, they paid $550,000 for it, but they spent thousands of dollars renovating and upgrading it. They decided, as many people do, to refinance their mortgage to pay for the work they were having done. They went to their lender, who hired Jeanette Miller through AMC Links to inspect the home and prepare the appraisal report. Her appraisal concluded the market value of the home at the time was $995,000. This was too low for Paul and Tanisha's loan to be approved. So that's, again, one of the direct impacts of this type of valuation. They were, of course, shocked. Less than a year earlier, they had applied for a previous mortgage refinance. Remember, over the time, the interest rates can fluctuate dramatically, and there's been a time period very recently before they went very high where interest rates were very low. So they had explored a previous mortgage refinance, and the house was appraised at $1,450,000, as they mentioned in the video. The lender agreed to send a different appraiser days later. So I think that was one of the questions I saw in the Q&A, is how does that second appraisal happen? It is quite often on the responsibility of the owner to make that request. A lot of real estate agents are very aware of this. So if you are working with a realtor, they can help with that type of request, and have been kind of an important part of educating people about this process and that opportunity to ask for a second appraisal. And we'll get more into detail about some of those steps and how to do that as we continue here. So again, they whitewashed the home, removed items that might indicate a Black family lived there. They even took the step, as many families in a lot of the case examples have, is bringing in a white friend or family member to pose as the homeowner instead, be home and let the appraiser in. The second appraiser resulted in nearly $500,000 higher amount than Miller's initial appraisal. So they filed a civil rights lawsuit in federal district court alleging discrimination on the basis of race in their appraisal. They did settle almost 2 years later, roughly 2 years later, for an undisclosed amount, with additional terms that I think are always important, and many civil rights advocates in our center always wants to see, is training. Let's figure out how not only to address this incident, but how can we prevent it from happening? And training is a key element of that. So there was training required. Interestingly, they required Miller to watch the Lowball documentary. Miller had to agree not to discriminate and had to continue to get continuing education specific to California law, which is pretty extensive at the state level in terms of civil rights. Michigan does a nice job, but I think California has even more civil rights laws on the books. So this is on top of all of what they were trying to do already, is pursuing their civil rights here and making a wrong into, as best they can, a right. Some powerful statements here I wanted to share from Tanisha Tate Austin herself. We missed out on a better interest rate. As I mentioned, that's a critical part of motivating a lot of people to take advantage of when those interest rates drop. Because of the unfair appraisal, they ended up in a higher interest rate, having to kind of go through that delay of asking for the second appraisal. Perhaps most importantly, having to erase our identity to get a better appraisal was a wrenching experience. We know of other Black families who either couldn't get a loan because of a discriminatory appraisal and therefore either lost the opportunity to buy or sell a home, or they had to sell their home because they had an unaffordable loan. Neighborhoods of color have been historically undervalued due to deliberate racist housing policies such as redlining. The ongoing undervaluation of homes in Black neighborhoods perpetuates the wealth gap between Black and white families. We hope by bringing attention to our case and this lawsuit settlement, we can help change the way the appraisal industry operates, and we can start to see a different trend. And again, there's links there to the lawsuit and the settlement. Another case that a lot of people were tracking that made big headlines was Doctors Connolly and Mott filing a lawsuit against 2020 Valuations, its owner Shane Lanham and LoanDepot.com, alleging discrimination on the basis of race and including their home's location, which was adjacent to a Black census block, but located within Homeland, an affluent, mostly white neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland area. Also alleging that LoanDepot.com discriminated against them by relying on that appraisal and denying their refinance loan. So their unique circumstances also, included the all three parties essentially of the discriminatory appraisal. They also whitewashed their home, had a second valuation, came back more than $250,000 higher than the initial appraisal. There's a link here to a video of the interview where they talk about their experiences. Dr. Mott was actually fighting cancer at the time and wanted to pursue this case, was so committed, as was the last couple we heard from, the Tate Austins, to raise awareness of this and really challenge it and say, this isn't going to happen to us. They filed a case. It did settle. There's a link to the settlement. Tragically, Dr. Mott passed away a few weeks before the settlement was reached with LoanDepot.com. So Dr. Connolly is featured kind of reacting to some of the outcomes, but they were both very, very brave, I think, in taking this on and helping turn the tide and making this needle move forward. There's a lot of studies about this. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but we just wanted to highlight a couple of points. Freddie Mac did a study in 2021, again, looking at the impact of appraisers' opinions. They are more likely to fall below the contract price in Black and Latino census tracts. As we've kind of heard, the loans can't be made. The extent of that gap increases as the percentage of the population of color in the tract increases. So it kind of tracks. The more people of color there are, that gap does increase. Even when we're controlling for things like structural and neighborhood characteristics, even when they kind of neutralize all other comparables, a property is more likely to receive an appraisal lower than the contract price if it is in a minority tract, according to this study. So this is clearly a systemic issue. It's not just about individual appraisers. The Federal Housing Finance Agency also did a study. There's others, there's Zillow, there's Redfin, there's many others. If you want any additional information, we can send you a lot. But they found potential race-related flags in the neighborhood description. There's an open space on the form with blank lines to be filled in. And the study of hundreds of appraisal reports found comments and descriptions of the racial and ethnic makeup of the area, noting foreign birthplaces of residences and languages spoken there, amenities specifically geared towards racial, ethnic, or religious groups. One town was described as having a, quote, Black race population above state average, end quote. Ethnic groups that have immigrated to the neighborhood over the course of many years were noted, and one called it a quote unquote one spicy neighborhood in their neighborhood description space. Another neighborhood was described as predominantly Hispanic and that the residents had assimilated their culture heritage into the neighborhood. So specifically identifying and calling out race, ethnicity, religious, and other types of makeup of the neighborhoods. Describing a property that was in a racially integrated neighborhood, but noting the community has no large institutional anchor comparable to other racially integrated neighborhoods noted in the city. Another one was originally founded as a whites-only city or sundown town, acknowledging that history, but noting that now it's fairly diverse with a diverse school system. And finally, an area that's not especially diverse ethnically, but has a high percentage of white people. So we're finding, as Lindsay laid out in that history, that these observations are still being utilized in today's processes and specifically noted. So that establishes that the appraiser indicated that this was important to include to establish value and sometimes impacted value very negatively. Another study cited here, licensed appraisers evaluating homes in white neighborhoods as double the value of homes in communities of color, even again, when we're controlling for property and other neighborhood characteristics. So these are not vastly different neighborhoods and vastly different buildings. We're controlling for that and still finding evidence of race-based discrimination. So it's continuing to grow. and the rate at which is expanding has just accelerated in the last few decades. This was all, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic, especially as we saw very hot housing markets, record low interest rates, people scrambling to refinance, things like that. Inequality between white neighborhood appraised values and those of communities of color is particularly stark for American Indian, Alaska, Native, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander communities, as noted in this study, again, which is linked here. What are these impacts? So an appraisal that's below the contract price can sometimes result in a higher down payment for the home buyer. This can sometimes derail the sale, of course. People don't often have extra pots of cash to contribute. We're often really doing the best we can with everything that we have to make the leap for homeownership or the American dream for some. It can also result in downward price renegotiations, which helps the buyer but reduces the seller's gains. And that, of course, has an impact on what they can purchase in their next home, what they can turn around and kind of take that next step to go up the homeownership ladder. A low valuation and refinancing can also damage a homeowner, can reduce the cash out available, sometimes affects that interest rate like we saw with our first case. It can change mortgage insurance premiums, which are all borne out over time. So Zillow and Redfin, I mentioned, also had done some studies. A lot of these are all 2021, so very recent data, but almost 40% of the $3 trillion wealth gap can be directly attributed to homeownership rates and home values. So huge impact here. The average home in a primarily Black neighborhood nationwide is worth $46,000 less than a comparable home in a primarily white neighborhood. Not only those individual impacts, but we also see the compounding effects, or what I call ripple effects. So, you have the market value of a home, it's undervalued, that impacts that individual, that family immediately, but it also undervalues the homes for list prices and appraised values for others in the surrounding community. So it impacts over time everyone. One of the first initial responses was the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE task force that the federal government put together, took a lot of this information in, put together a final action report with specific recommendations. That's all linked here. Back in 2022, they did a nice job looking at the history. They looked at various forms of bias and called it out. And then they set out some steps that federal agencies can take to advance equity in the appraisal process, and other stakeholders as well. So this is fairly new to the fair housing movement. The National Fair Housing Alliance, or NAFA, tracks cases across the country, and 2023 was the year they first started carving out and sharing appraisal case data independently as a standalone transaction type. So we saw 87 appraisal bias cases reported in 2023 among all the agencies, including fair housing centers that would take those cases. One of the outcomes that has been met of the PAVE recommendation was HUD issuing new guidance to the Federal Housing Administration, hoping to protect borrowers from appraisal bias. They developed a new reconsideration of value policy, or ROV. We'll talk about those here in a moment, that requires specific lenders in the single family program to provide a way for borrowers to request reviews of home appraisal valuations. It includes both FHA insured mortgages and those purchased or guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So the federal government is instituting some changes within its house, so to speak, and those often lead to regulations or guidance that can be applied to the rest of the industry through more HUD guidance or even case law. There's also a groundbreaking settlement that HUD just reached very recently with the Appraisal Foundation, or TAF. TAF sets the standards and qualifications for real estate appraisers and provides voluntary guidance for all industry valuation professionals. One of the big conversation points of this issue was a lot of people coming to the understanding or awareness that almost 95% of appraisers and assessors were white, as tracked in 2023. This is a huge lack of diversity in this field. The kind of becoming an appraiser professional really relies on existing appraisers being willing to apprentice and supervise people to come on board into the profession. They have to supervise on-the-job experience hours for licensure. And this has always essentially perpetuated the homogeneity of the profession by race. So it's really limited any sort of racial diversity in the field. So the agreement with HUD requires policy changes to expand those pathways for people to become appraisers, to diversify that profession. It includes over $1 million scholarship fund for a program that will start to build that alternate pathway. So we're kind of breaking into different portions of the contributing factors of appraisal discrimination. I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I do want to answer questions, but I also want to cover everything. So bear with me here. We just wanted to call out and kind of summarize a lot of these we've discussed in our cases and some of the history, but signs of possible appraisal discrimination include, having an appraisal amount report coming back with an amount that's lower than expected or lower than a recent valuation without a reason that would bear up to any scrutiny. Your properties being compared to other lower value properties that are very different in size, condition, or location is another way to identify something that might bear further scrutiny. If a lender refuses to reconsider the valuation request, as occurred in the Mott case, I believe that's something else that could be a red flag. Also, it's really important to look at the appraisal report, written and verbal comments, as we shared from some of the studies. Anything that refers to race, national origin, or any other protected characteristic regarding a homeowner or the neighborhood tied to the appraiser. We also see appraisal reports in these cases that have many unexplained errors or just completely inaccurate information. You may see language such as crime-ridden, lacking pride, undergoing demographic shift. That warrants further scrutiny. It could be potentially shown to be discriminatory. All of these cases would have to be evaluated for that. I think I saw a comment on blight, so that is an element that would have to be considered. In terms of, is this a code word? What does this mean? What are the statistics? What does the appraisal document say? If it's not including any positive aspects of the neighborhood, that could be a red flag. If what is conducted is variation from established practices of the company, the practitioner, the appraiser themselves, or just a deviation from best practices in general, could point to elements of discrimination. So what can you do as advocates, as individuals going through this process? Thoroughly review and fact check the report. Got to take a look at everything. Look at the comparable sales that were used to establish the value. The comps should generally be located within a mile of the property being appraised, should be in similar condition, close in age, square footage, and number of rooms. People have the right to ask for that ROV, the reconsideration of value, from your lender. This is the reassessment, the second appraisal of the home. Your real estate agent can help you. And this is something that a lot of the education and energy is going towards, is helping people develop policies that make an ROV request much easier. More people should know about it. It should be something that is kind of automatically part of the process. One of the experts that actually has spoken at one of our events, Jillian White, put together a step-by-step video on how to dispute a low appraisal amount. So we've linked that video there. And of course, we encourage people to report any discrimination to our Fair Housing Center or any local Fair Housing Center. We take complaints and cases by phone, by email, by letter, any way that we can be contacted. There's no cost for us to represent someone who is reporting housing discrimination. We can accept anonymous complaints and allegations of housing discrimination as well. That's something you can send directly to the education and outreach team if you'd like, or ask us questions about how to do that. We're happy to help. Our enforcement staff can directly contact potential clients with their consent and authorization. There may be simply some education that can get this process back on the road. If our client says, yes, you can contact the bank or you can contact the appraiser, we can do that. We also have options for cases to be filed in the courts, administratively with HUD or the state. There's options, and we would go through that with all of our clients. Any initial inquiries, we recommend you contact enforcement coordinators directly if you feel you have an allegation of discrimination. They will go through all of the questions and have all the great information on what options and steps need to be taken. The more information we have upfront, the better. So the sooner the better is also very helpful. Documentation is really critical. So we always say, remember, record, and report, the 3 R's. So maintaining documentation for yourself or whoever you're advocating for is really critical. There's a time frame of up to 3 years in the state of Michigan, but these are kind of the statute of limitations for how long the window to file either in court or administratively is. So again, that's something our staff would kind of walk people through. Also, please note that no one should be retaliated against for exercising their fair housing rights. That is explicitly prohibited by law. So I'm open to staff assisting me if anybody wants to help make sure I don't miss questions. I'm seeing questions in kind of different places, or I'm seeing the chat is active too. So that would be helpful. I think I answered the question about second appraisals. The bank does not have to request it, but the homeowner could go back to their initial lender and request that reconsideration of value ROV or a second appraisal. The link between
with that, sorry, Liz,
sorry.
Right before you move on, somebody did have asked if they have to repay for a ROV.
That's a great question. I think that's something that people are considering in their policies. I think we would have to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure. If I think the basis is discriminatory, I really would not want to see a cost for that, but that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that.
And then the other, you had mentioned that there is a link between blight and appraisals. Somebody wanted to have some further information on that link between the two regarding how blight laws can produce segregation and how that might impact on appraisals. It's a very big question, and
it's a big question, a good one. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think we'd
and I'm
have to
not
look
sure.
into it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if Lindsay, as you've done research on this, if you came across any links or anything to provide to maybe that person to look into. Otherwise, that would be something we would just need to look into.
Yeah, I think from what I remember from my graduate school studies, there is a link between urban renewal policies in like the 60s, 70s, 50s, when they were starting to like tear down buildings and build up parking lots and malls and suburban areas and highways. There was explicitly like racial policies about blighting neighborhoods and then demolishing them. If you want specific examples, the city of St. Louis and several neighborhoods in the city center of St. Louis would be a good place to look at. They just built a soccer stadium in a neighborhood that had previously been completely demolished 50 years ago to make way for essentially just tore down a Black neighborhood, blighted it. Anyways, there are policies that that blight was used to harm Black communities and other communities of color. And there's also evidence that redlining and preventing neighborhoods and communities of color from being able to purchase homes in their neighborhoods have prevented neighbors from being able to maintain those properties, and those properties just sitting there and degrading because no one can own them. So there's a lot that goes into that, a lot of different factors.
Big question, as Bree said. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for the examples on the fly. I really appreciate that. And we always believe that training on both sides of the fence, so to speak, from the housing professional standpoint and from housing advocates, housing consumers, is really critical. We need to raise awareness and help people understand they have the right to uphold their fair housing choice, and that the housing industry has a responsibility to comply. So one of the things that we always are interested in seeing as an outcome of any enforcement action is training and helping people put the right policies and best practices in place to comply with the law. It's kind of the leaky faucet idea of we want to stop we'll handle case by case, drip by drip, but we also want to fix the leak. Change those policies, change those practices. And I think that's what the PAVE task force and a lot of these cases are really starting to do. You've got a complete overhaul of how appraisers are trained and developed as professionals, on the deck, for example, and that's really significant. Banks, I think, could be very liable if they are utilizing appraisers that are discriminatory. Some of the cases that we've seen have really required appraisers and some of their partners to certify that they have never been subject to a claim of discrimination. So that's something new that's coming online. So I think a bank absolutely could have some liability, especially if they refuse to, engage in an ROV or that reconsideration. There have been several banks held responsible in these, very recent cases that have come out of the early 2020s awareness and some of the media coverage that we've had, where they can be liable if they're a part of the discrimination occurring. The fair housing laws were really crafted to where the liability can be extended to any party in most cases that had a role in discriminating on any of the protected classes. I think a lot of the lenders are really looking at this very carefully because they don't want to be subject to a fair housing complaint, but not all of them, as you can see, based on the sheer volume of some of the cases and complaints happening. So some of the proactive ones, I think, are definitely taking steps. But this is where consumer and advocate awareness is really critical, because we can help create that interest and apply that pressure for those changes to be made. So great questions. Am I missing any more? Maybe one more. I think a question in the chat very quickly about, these homes being under or overvalued. Could this be reflective of the cost of increasing rent prices all over? Oh, how can we prevent price gouging? I will say that the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, is also working on some of these elements. So they have a website. They've been one of the parties at the table to help address this. We do not have rent caps in Michigan. Very few places in the country actually have the ability to legally limit increases in rent, for example. So that's an element, I think, that could be contributing to the overall state of the housing market, and certainly to access as well. Yeah. So great questions. We encourage you very much to fill out the evaluation. Let us know your thoughts. I think we'll put that link in the chat if we haven't already. Got great information here about an antitrust lawsuit. The DOJ, Department of Justice, brings pattern and practice cases. So they bring really big cases where we have a lot of impacted parties, but it looks like they're going after the software company RealPage for collusion and rental price increases. I forgot about that case. Thank you for sharing that. This is very much a topic of equal access right now, is the impact of some of these algorithms, these software programs, these companies that are using automated services and removing humans. There was an initial assumption that this would remove racial bias, but we are finding it is not. And in fact, it can create a negative impact on the protected classes as well. ProPublica has tons of great information. So thanks for sharing that. If you're interested in that case, go to ProPublica and search for the RealPage case. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us. I know we're a little bit over time, so we thank you for attending. Please